Okay, folks, welcome back again to another exciting video from the DeLINEATE team. Today we're going to talk to you a little bit about setting up the TensorFlow backend. Now, if you watched our other video on just setting up the toolbox in general, what you saw is that we rely on a deep learning library called Keras to do our deep learning. And Keras can have a couple of different backends. The one that we had previously used was called Theano, but Theano development, as of the time I'm talking to you, this has ceased active development. So Smart Money is on eventually switching to TensorFlow. So we just started porting our workflow over to TensorFlow ourselves recently. Did the initial test to make sure that would work okay and everything, and it looks like it will. So I'll show you guys how to set that up as the backend to your Keras. Theano should still work for a little while, especially if you keep all your software versions kind of where they were when Theano was current, but TensorFlow is the long-term backend. So I'm going to do all this from my virtual desktop into one of our analysis machines named Flexo. This is one of the machines that we set up in one of the previous videos. So here we are at my blank desktop. One thing I'm going to do first, actually, is if you saw the previous video, I'm just going to make this terminal window big. Edit my bashrc file, because when I did this before, I commented out this thing that is added by the Anaconda installer. So if none of this makes any sense to you, you might want to go at least skim our previous video on how to set this stuff up. Not the only way, but an easy way to run this stuff is using the Anaconda framework to maintain kind of a different Python installation than your default system Python installation. But I previously commented this little couple of lines out here because this actually kind of interferes with our virtual desktop to have these paths set up for some weird reason. But what we can do is actually, I'm going to add a bash alias, and hopefully I can get this right. Let's call this, I'll call it conda path. And I'm just going to take this essential command here and make that a little command that I can alias. And execute at will so that it's not running when I start up, but I can make it run when I want it to. All right, now I got to add some backslashes to escape some special characters. So I want that quote to be treated as not the quote that ends the alias, but a quote inside the command. And I want that to be treated as not special either. And I think that's it. So let's see if that works. You may not have to do this if you don't use the particular Windows system that we are using here, this XFCE, but yeah, you'll get a few Linux tips while we're doing this in addition to the actual deep learning stuff. So let's see if this works, if I screw anything up. This video is going to be, by the way, this video will be a little more casual than the last one, the basic setup one, because I have not done this as many times as I've done the other stuff. So you might see me make a few errors here and there. But anyway, looks like so the default system Python right now is 2.7, which is true for just Ubuntu in general. So let's see if I can do my conda path command. Oops. Oh, you know what I need to do? There's one of those errors I was mentioning. For that alias to take effect, I need to start a new terminal so that my bashrc executes. So let's try that. So still, if I look at the default Python, yep, still 2.712. Another little pro tip, Control D will exit you out of Python super fast. That makes an end of file character, which a lot of Linux software takes to mean exit this software. Okay, so let's try conda path. And let's see which is now our current Python. Okay, yeah, so that seems to have executed correctly. See that now the conda path does what I want to do, which adds Anaconda 3 to my path, which means that now the Python that it will launch if I just type Python is the Anaconda installation of Python, which you see up here is in opt Anaconda 3 bin Python, which is where I installed Anaconda during the previous setup step. Okay, so now I have my Anaconda environment. I have my Python 3. Again, you could probably use Python 2.7 for this stuff, but we tend to use Python 3 around here. So, do what you want to do, but your mileage may vary a little bit if you're using a different version of Python, or of course, if you're not using Anaconda and you're just putting everything in your system Python paths. Okay, So let's take a look just quickly at the TensorFlow website and see what we're going to have to do to get TensorFlow set up. I know this, but you might not. Okay, so let's see, TensorFlow. It has some pretty good install instructions, although there are many different paths to potentially take. So we are on Ubuntu. And let's see, which way do we want it to go? They recommend using pip in a virtual environment, using pip in your system environment, a Docker container, Anaconda, or just from source. Since we are already running in kind of an Anaconda world, for the other stuff we're doing, I'm going to go the Anaconda route. But it's a kind of similar experience, whichever way you go. It just depends on whether you want to kind of keep your TensorFlow installation separate from some of your other stuff on your system. Okay, so we're going to roughly follow these steps, but kind of modify them as appropriate for our usage anyway. So first of all, we've already done the Anaconda download, so we can skip that step. Next thing we're going to do is create an Anaconda environment. In other words, kind of a little sandboxed Python world specifically for TensorFlow. So let me bring this guy back here and maybe make it smaller here so I can. Actually, let's make both of these actually windowed so that we can kind of see what we're doing in both places at once. All right. So let's give this a shot. All right. So they say to create a conda environment named TensorFlow. Just for grins, I'm going to create a different named TensorFlow environment just so you can kind of see. You can call it whatever you want to. So let's call ours TF test or something like that. So that's our TensorFlow test environment. And then we are going to want to do pip and Python equals whatever our Python version is. Mine's 3.6.5. I don't know if you really need the most minor version number, but that's how I've done it before, and why mess with success. So let's see, that looks like that should do it. So Anaconda will kind of figure out what it needs to install in your new virtual environment. And by the way, again, if any of you are like serious Python people and I misuse any sort of Python terminology, please do not completely freak out. I'm not a... I know how to use the Python programming language, but I'm not I'm in with the whole Python ethos, so I may not get all the terminology exactly right all the time, but I know how to do the stuff that we need to do. Okay, so it's done making our virtual environment. It tells us what we're going to need to do, which is when we want to make that environment active, in other words, when we want to kind of go into the little sandboxed world that we've just created, we'll say source activate and then the name of the environment, which is tf-test. To deactivate it when it's running, we say source deactivate. And of course, we will have to have our Anaconda paths active if you don't leave them active all the time, because otherwise that command doesn't do anything. So you have to have your Anaconda set up if you're going to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and do like it says in the next step here, which is to activate our virtual environment. Of course, ours is now not called TensorFlow, it's called tf-test. So let's say source activate tf-test. Okay, and we get a little parentheses tf-test like they say, changing our prompts so we know that we are in our tf-test environment. And then we have to enter a pip command. Again, pip is the Python package manager, but we're not going to install it for the whole system Python if we're inside this virtual environment. We're only going to install it inside the little TensorFlow or tf-test environment. So we're going to do, so we don't really need the ignore installed, and I don't think we need the upgrade because we don't have it installed yet, but we'll just do it exactly like they say. And then this last thing you need is the URL of the TensorFlow package that you're going to use. So let's open that and see. There are many choices to this. It's a little bit funky. So if we're using Python 2.7, nope, we're not. We're not using Python 3.4 or 3.5 either. We're actually using Python 3.6. And there are different packages if you plan to only run CPU-based analysis versus if you have one that's GPU-enabled. We would like to run on the GPU because we would like our analyses to finish sometime in our lifetimes. So we will be copying the... Oops, you know what? I just copied everything, didn't I? I only want that line. Okay, there we go. I'm going to copy that. And where it says TF binary URL, you will, of course, paste the URL to that particular TensorFlow. So we got pip install, -- ignore install, -- upgrade, and then the name of our URL. So then I think we're ready to hit enter. So this will install the TensorFlow package and any dependencies of it, in our virtual environment. So that'll take a minute or two while it gets all those dependencies set up. There is some other stuff we're going to have to do, actually, at least in our setup. Oh, okay, there we go. At least in our setup to make sure that our TensorFlow installation actually works. So, we can try this and see. We can try doing what they suggest doing. So they tell us to validate our installation, run a short TensorFlow program. So, all right, we can try that. So we have done our environment preparation. That's fine. If we want to run a short TensorFlow program, just go into Python. We aren't even going to have to go very far. Let's just do import TensorFlow. We don't have to do the rest of that stuff because we're already hitting errors, right? And the error it's giving us is basically saying that it can't find the right version of some of the libraries that relies upon to do various CUDA stuff, to do GPU-based computation. And that's because when we set up this machine earlier, we set it up with the latest version of the NVIDIA CUDA stuff, which at the time of this speaking is 9.2, but also at the time of me speaking, the latest version that TensorFlow actually works with is 9.0. So what we're going to have to actually do is go ahead to the NVIDIA site. Let's open a new browser window and download. I think you have to say like older CUDA version, something like that. I mean, if you're Googling, I don't know the exact URL. Because if you just Google download CUDA, it'll take you to the current version, but we need not the latest release, but a slightly older release. So let's get to CUDA 9.0. So we're on Linux, x86, Ubuntu. We're on Ubuntu 16.04. Of course, your mileage may vary if you're on a different system. I like to download as a run file. And there's a few different things to download. We've got the base installer, then there's some patches that were released. You probably don't have to install the patches, I would think. It looks like they're mainly for performance, not for... there are some bugs and stuff, but I suspect they're probably not critical, but we'll go ahead and be good boys and girls and download it anyway. Okay, so, and install them anyway, rather. Okay, so what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to get out of... okay, I'm going to deactivate my environment for a second. Not that it really matters, but I will. And actually, just again, not that it really matters, but I'm going to actually start up a new terminal with my Anaconda deactivated. There's no real reason. I just like to keep my paths nice and clean just in case anything gets funky, although there's no real reason to think it should. I'm going to actually because this stuff is kind of busy, I'm going to actually make a new directory. Let's call that CUDA 9.0, whoops, 0, and move all the CUDA 9.0 stuff. CUDA 9.0 star to there. So that's all the stuff that we've downloaded last time, as well as some other things that I've installed. Okay, but here's the stuff I just downloaded. So what we're going to need to do here is basically install the CUDA 9.0 libraries. Now the good news is you can have multiple versions of CUDA installed on your system at one time. It doesn't seem to cause any issues for us. The only thing you're going to have to do is be a little bit careful when you install it not to install an old version of the NVIDIA graphics drivers as well, because we want to keep our graphics drivers current, and we don't want to have to do the thing we did in the main setup where we reboot our system in text-only mode and all that stuff. We really just want to install the CUDA libraries and keep our actual video driver as current as possible. So one thing I think I need to do is make all these runnable. So now they are runnable files. And I'm going to sudo each of them in turn, starting with the main installer. So let's run that sucker. Oh yeah, let's specify the directory. Okay. All right, so this will be us installing the older CUDA driver. Again, I guess if by the time you do this yourself, TensorFlow works with the latest version of the CUDA drivers, I'm going to accept the EULA. If TensorFlow works with the latest version of the CUDA drivers, you may not have to install more than one version of the CUDA, well, the libraries rather. But you might. So, this is what you'll want to do if you want to install the CUDA stuff, but not the driver. So this is the critical question. Do we want to install the accelerated graphics drivers? I'm going to say no, because we do not need a new driver or an old driver. We just need the toolkit. I do want to install that. That is a perfectly fine location, so I will keep that. I'm not going to install a symbolic link at this time at user local CUDA, because I'll reserve that link to just user local CUDA to be for the latest version, the one that I want to use most of the time. So that's going to be a no. I'm also not going to bother installing the CUDA 9.0 samples. I installed the CUDA 9.2 samples when we set this machine up, and I feel like I don't really need sample code or anything for the older version here. Okay, so that's just going to install for a minute or two. Should complete fairly quickly. It's much faster than installing the full driver because, less stuff to install. I realized in the last video I said something, there was a command, an ld config command that we had to enter, and I said something about how it was a little bit like voodoo to us. I realized after the fact that I totally know why you have to do this, and it even says so in the installer. So that was just me being not thinking straight, I guess. But anyway, as it tells us here, you want to make sure that our path includes user local CUDA 9.0 bin, which, okay, fine, and that our library path includes, we actually won't be doing that, but we also won't be directly running that stuff, so that's fine. We have the later version of CUDA for that stuff. But to make sure that basically things that look for shared libraries find our CUDA libraries, we are going to have to run that ld config command at an appropriate time point for the user local CUDA stuff so that it can find those shared libraries. If that makes no sense to you, don't worry about it. We'll get to it in a minute. Okay, so now our CUDA driver is installed. The one other thing we are going to have to do if we want to do any neural network stuff. Oh, sorry, I lied. There's a couple other things we want to do, which is if we want to make sure we have the latest version of everything, let's go and run our patches. So let's see. So that's going to be .1. That's our first patch. I assume, although I did not see the documentation being particularly clear on this. Let's see. I assume we want to install these patches in numerical order. That seems logical to me. So there was number 1. That goes pretty quickly. Number 2, accept all the EULAs. Okay, that looks good. If you're wondering how I'm skipping through the EULA each time, I'm just hitting Q to quit, because it looks like it's just using the more or the less command, which you can exit out of with quit. So I totally, of course, read the EULA in its entirety before we did this. Wink. Okay, so all right, all of our patches are installed. So now our CUDA 9.0 should be set up and as up to date as it can possibly be without going to CUDA 9.1 or 9.2. So if we looked in and user local CUDA, now we have what we had previously installed, which is CUDA 9.2, but also user local CUDA 9.0. And like I just said, this user local CUDA is just an alias to the latest version. We haven't changed anything about that. But now we've got this as well, which is what TensorFlow is going to want. Okay, so there are a few more things we need to do here. One of them is, if you remember our basic setup, we didn't just have to install CUDA and the NVIDIA drivers. We also had to install CUDNN to do neural network stuff. So that was this installer here, which I previously downloaded for 9.2. The good news is, at least as far as I can tell, and maybe this will come back to bite me later, but as far as I can tell, it should be okay to use the same CUDNN libraries with CUDA 9.0 as with CUDA 9.2. Frankly, for all I know, we might have been fine with CUDA 9.2 also if we had just put in a directory named CUDA 9.0. But I figured if TensorFlow is looking for CUDA 9.0, may as well give it CUDA 9.0. But as far as I can tell, even though the CUDNN says 9.2, it seems to work okay with CUDA 9.0. So anyway, to be lazy, I'm going to just go ahead and install the same CUDNN libraries that I did for CUDA 9.2. But if you want to be super safe, presumably you could go download the old CUDNNs that the slightly older CUDNNs that worked with CUDA 9.0. So anyway, when we unzipped this last time, it created this directory here, CUDA. So the CUDNN creates this CUDA directory. So we're basically going to do the same thing we did before, which is go into that CUDA directory. And again, it has the include and lib64 directories, which are like the parallel directories in, let's see, what's that called? CUDA-9.0. And so 9.0 and 9.2 both have include and lib64 directories of their own. And we're just going to copy CUDNN.h to user local CUDA 9.0. And that needs a sudo in front of it, so I'll do sudo. Oh, you know what? Sorry. Copy that to the include directory, not just the main directory of user local CUDA 9. All right, so there's that. And there's more stuff in the lib64, so I'll just do a star there. And I'll copy that to user local CUDA 9.0 lib64. Looks good. Okay, so now we've got CUDNN installed for CUDA 9.0 as well as CUDA 9.2. Now at this point, we will want to make sure that we have done our LD config thing. Again, this is probably something like, as it said in the installer, you could more permanently alter that file whose name I always forget. Oh, I might have already closed the window. But anyway, there, that directory that has the oh yeah, here we go. So we could right. So you could permanently edit the etc ld.so.conf, I suppose, but I've just usually manually run the ld config thing when I want to make sure these shared libraries are loaded. So anyway, so ld config and just give them the user local CUDA. We previously just did user local CUDA, I think /lib64, but we actually want to make sure we specifically tell it about CUDA 9.0 and lib64. Okay, that's fine. That's just a warning, but don't worry about that. And I think that should be everything we need to do in order to get our TensorFlow running. So let's just I'll go back to my main home folder, although it doesn't really matter, and do source activate tf test. Whoops. Oh, you know what I didn't do? All right, so now I have access to my Anaconda stuff. Now let's do source activate tf test. Now I'm in my tf test Anaconda virtual environment. Let's run my Python. Let's see if I can import TensorFlow now. Let's see if I forgot any steps. Oh, look. Apparently I did not. Okay. So if that's all right, then we should be able to run this short little TensorFlow program, which, as it says, this basically just like makes a kind of dummy little TensorFlow program. And basically if it outputs hello TensorFlow, then the basics seem to be working okay. And look, it totally does. So it prints out hello TensorFlow, and that all looks good. So it seems to us that TensorFlow is actually working. So hurrah. That wasn't actually too bad, right? So so now TensorFlow is working. Now, if we want to actually make sure that our toolbox, the DeLINEATE toolbox, is working with TensorFlow, got to do a few more steps. So one of them is right now, let's see, let me go back into Python here in my virtual environment. If I try to import Keras, that will not work. Because why? Because I started a virtual environment that did not have Keras installed. So my main Python, or my main Anaconda environment, does have Keras installed because I've already set that up on this machine. But this little sub environment that has TensorFlow installed in it does not have Keras installed. So I'm going to need to first install Keras, which we do rely on. So opt Anaconda 3. Actually, technically I don't have to do that because actually maybe I don't know which way it doesn't probably make a difference. Let's just do sudo pip install Keras. Oops, apparently I do have to do that. Sudo opt Anaconda 3 bin pip install Keras. Okay, so that should install Keras. Whoops, maybe it didn't. All right, what am I doing wrong here? Okay, no, I think I do need to do the yeah, I think I do need to do the environment specific pip. And wait a minute, let's just try this. All right, that should work. I got a little mixed up apparently. Couldn't remember. So I think the deal here is that sudo doesn't know where the pip command is because we're in a virtual environment that messes with the paths. I guess I'd usually do it with sudo if I were doing it in the main Python packages or in my main Anaconda, but looks like you don't need the sudo when you're in a virtual environment. Oh, okay. So this is all okay so far. So I did, I imported Keras, and Keras is now installed. Now it's giving me an error because it's not finding the Theano module, right? Because currently we still do have, if you look in my Keras.json file, which is my main Keras configuration file, I've told that my backend of preference is Theano, right? So it's telling me, oh, you don't have Theano installed because, again, in this virtual TF test environment, I do not, although I do have Theano installed in my main Anaconda environment. But it is correct that I don't have a module named Theano, which is okay because I actually want to use TensorFlow in this environment. Now, I could just change the backend in my Keras.json file to TensorFlow. I believe it's just TensorFlow written out. But of course, then that's going to change my default for everything. So if I just want to do TensorFlow stuff kind of temporarily when I'm in the TF test environment, I can manually enter. Basically, what I can do is I can set an environment variable in the sort of bash environment that says Keras backend is TensorFlow. So to do that, so if I want to just quickly test it, I don't know if everyone knows this stuff. If I just want to set that environment variable for the time duration of one command, I can just do that before I enter the command. So I've hit Keras backend equals TensorFlow. And if I do Python-C, this is a quick way to test this stuff. This will just test this one line of Python code. Okay, so that'll just run that one line, and it'll import Keras temporarily and just tell us that it has the TensorFlow backend. That all works fine, right? But if I try to see what my backend environment variable is, it's nothing, right? So basically, that Keras backend environment variable supersedes the backend thing in the Keras.json file. But if I activate it like this before I put in the command, it only sets that Keras backend for the duration of running that one command, right? So if I want to set it for this whole session, I just can say export Keras backend equals TensorFlow. Again, none of this stuff, if you're not a real Linux nerd, most of the stuff that I'm doing right now is not super specific to deep learning or DeLINEATE or any of that stuff. It's just kind of general Linux stuff. So, if you don't know what an environment variable is or whatever, I'm not going to get super deep into that, but you can look that up in many places around the web. But basically what I'm doing is setting a very specific environment variable known as Keras backend, which Keras will look for when it runs. And now it'll see TensorFlow. So now if I were to go in here and import Keras, it'll use the TensorFlow backend until I deactivate my Anaconda virtual environment, or until I close this shell entirely. Okay. So let's do one more quick test here, and let's actually get my toolbox downloaded. So here I'm gonna let's see, I don't think I have it downloaded yet. So why don't I make a directory called that, and let's go to our DeLINEATE website. We're still on, as you're hearing me now, we are still on. The release version is 0.2b, although the next version might be coming out semi-soon. So I'm going to just, again, be a nerd and download that via curl-O in the URL, which will just download that file. Capital O, by the way, if you've never used it, curl just downloads a URL. The -O names the output file the same as it was named on the server. It has to be a capital O though. Lowercase o means something different. Okay, so I'll unzip that. There's our toolbox unzipped, and it's in that folder. And then if I've got everything set up right, I've set it to use the TensorFlow backend and everything. I should just be able to go in and say Python delineate.py, and I'll run my sample job file, which let's run the small CNN sample job file. So should use the TensorFlow backend, and fingers crossed it recognizes our GPU okay, and yep, looks like it's running just fine on our NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti. So there we go. So that's pretty much it. That's not too painful, hopefully. Now, of course, if you're setting up a system from scratch, you would basically want to go back to our other video that has the full system set up, and at the point where you're installing Theano, just kind of divert and install your TensorFlow stuff instead. And of course, again, you don't have to install the TensorFlow specifically in an Anaconda virtual environment. You could install it in your main Anaconda environment, or you could set all of this stuff up not in a sandboxed environment at all. You could just set it up in your main system Python if you're the only person doing this stuff and you don't mind dumping a bunch of packages all into the system Python. So do what you want to do. That's going to be more dependent on your personal workflow and how you like to keep your paths arranged and all that stuff. But anyway, that's pretty much it. So I'm going to let this classify away, and good luck installing your own TensorFlow and using our toolbox. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.